already know the version of Kurt Cobain that documentaries return to again and again. The screaming, the smashed guitars, the flannel, the interviews clipped down to sound bites. The rise, the chaos, the collapse. What usually gets lost in that version is not some secret scandal or hidden conspiracy, but something much quieter and harder to dramatize. How Kurt Cobain actually lived, day to day, when the cameras were off and there was nothing to perform. This is not a story about the end of his life. It's about the texture of it, the routines he struggled to maintain, the physical discomfort he talked about constantly, the way he filled his time, the habits his friends noticed, and the version of Kurt that existed in apartments, hotel rooms, rehearsal spaces, and notebooks, not on stage. One of the most consistently documented facts about Kurt Cobain's daily life is that he lived with chronic physical pain for years. Long before Nirvana became famous, Kurt talked openly about severe stomach problems. He underwent medical tests, including endoscopies, and repeatedly described persistent pain that doctors struggled to diagnose conclusively. In interviews, he linked this pain to stress, anger, and anxiety.
It's gone.
Yeah?
Yeah. I finally have been prescribed the right stomach medicine after 6 years of being in constant pain. Finally, I haven't had a stomach problem for like over a year now.
And said it affected nearly every part of his life. This wasn't a minor complaint. It was something he returned to again and again when explaining his mental state. Because of that pain, Kurt's daily rhythms were often irregular. Friends and collaborators described him as someone who had trouble keeping conventional schedules. He slept at odd hours, especially during tours and recording periods. This wasn't unusual in the music world, but in Kurt's case, it was often tied to discomfort rather than partying. When you're in pain, sleep becomes fragmented. When sleep is fragmented, everything else becomes harder. Kurt did not present himself as someone who enjoyed routine, and yet his writings suggest he craved stability. In his journals, which contain notes, lists, fragments of letters, drawings, and lyrics, you can see someone trying to organize thoughts that never quite line up. These weren't polished diary entries. They were scattered, obsessive, repetitive. He would return to the same ideas again and again, rewriting them, crossing them out, reframing them. This pattern is one of the clearest windows into his off-camera mind. Contrary to the stereotype that followed him, people close to Kurt have pushed back against the idea that he neglected personal hygiene. Chris Novoselic, who knew him as well as anyone, has publicly stated that Kurt did not have hygiene problems and that he bathed regularly, often soaking in the tub for long periods. This detail matters because it cuts directly against the lazy caricature of Kurt as someone who didn't care about himself. What people around him described wasn't neglect, it was inconsistency in other areas of life, paired with moments of deliberate self-care. What Kurt did struggle with consistently was comfort, physical comfort, emotional comfort, social comfort. He was known to be deeply uncomfortable in crowded or performative social situations offstage. People who met him expecting a loud, confrontational personality were often surprised by how quiet he was in person. He spoke softly. He avoided eye contact. He often seemed guarded, even shy. This is where the public and private Kurts diverge most sharply. On stage, he could be confrontational and explosive. Offstage, he was reserved and inward. Friends described him as someone who listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was often cautiously, with a kind of self-monitoring that suggested he was worried about being misunderstood. That fear of being misunderstood shows up constantly in Kurt's own words. In interviews and in his journals, he expressed frustration that Nirvana's music was being framed as purely angry or nihilistic. He insisted repeatedly that the songs came from pain, not aggression. He disliked being turned into a spokesman for anything, especially for a generation. He resisted labels, even as they were applied to him over and over again. At home or in private spaces, Kurt's interests were often simple. He watched television. He liked cartoons and low-stakes entertainment that didn't demand interpretation. This wasn't escapism in a glamorous sense. It was relief. Something passive. Something that didn't require him to explain himself. Clothing, too, was practical rather than performative. Kurt often wore oversized sweaters and layered clothes not as a fashion statement, but because they were comfortable and familiar. Friends have said he disliked feeling physically exposed. Loose clothing gave him a sense of distance from his own body, which he often described as a source of pain or frustration. Food was another area shaped by his stomach problems. Kurt frequently talked about difficulty eating without discomfort. Biographical accounts describe him gravitating towards simple foods that were easy to tolerate, especially while touring. This wasn't about image or ideology. It was about minimizing pain. When eating hurts, meals stop being social experiences and start becoming calculations. Creatively, Kurt's work habits were uneven but intense. He could become deeply absorbed in writing or drawing for long stretches, especially when alone. He didn't write lyrics the way many professional songwriters do in structured sessions. He wrote when ideas pressed themselves forward, often late at night. His notebooks show a mix of artistic ambition and deep self-criticism, sometimes on the same page. Those notebooks also reveal something else. Kurt was preoccupied with authenticity. He worried constantly about being perceived as fake, calculated, or dishonest. He distrusted fame and the machinery around it, even as he benefited from it. This internal conflict didn't make him disengage. It made him anxious. He wanted control over how he was seen, but he knew he couldn't have it. People close to Kurt described his mood as changeable, but not theatrical. He wasn't someone who staged emotional outbursts in private. When he was overwhelmed, he tended to withdraw. Silence, rather than confrontation, was his default response to stress. This withdrawal was often misinterpreted as aloofness, but those who knew him well understood it as overload. Despite his reputation for darkness, Kurt was not humorless. He had a dry, sometimes absurd sense of humor that leaned toward irony and self-mockery. He often undercut serious conversations with jokes, especially when they became too personal. Humor was a way to redirect attention away from himself when he felt exposed. One of the most consistent themes in how friends described Kurt was sensitivity. He was deeply affected by criticism, even when he pretended not to be. Negative press lingered with him. He reread interviews. He fixated on perceived slights. Praise made him uncomfortable, but criticism hurt. This combination made public life especially difficult. As Nirvana's success grew, Kurt's daily life became increasingly constrained by expectation. Interviews, photo shoots, and appearances multiplied, and each one required him to perform a version of himself that he didn't fully recognize. This disconnect between who he felt like privately and who he was expected to be publicly is one of the most documented sources of his distress. It's important to say this clearly. Nothing about Kurt Cobain's day-to-day life suggests someone who wanted to become a myth. What it suggests is someone who wanted relief from pain, from misunderstanding, from constant interpretation. He wanted space. He wanted quiet. He wanted to make music without being turned into a symbol. When you remove the dramatic framing and look closely at the documented details of Kurt's daily existence, what you see is not chaos for its own sake, but struggle. A person trying to function while carrying physical pain, emotional sensitivity, and overwhelming public pressure, all at the same time. This is the version of Kurt Cobain that rarely makes it into documentaries, because it doesn't fit neatly into a narrative arc. It's repetitive. It's unresolved. It's human. It's a life made up of routines that don't quite work, comforts that don't quite comfort, and a constant attempt to explain something that never feels fully explainable. And maybe that's the most honest way to understand him, not as a symbol frozen in time, but as a person moving through days that were often harder than they looked from the outside.